smoothest, I'm telling you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar today, part of our Blueprint for Growth series, where we are discussing how to succeed in South Africa and make it the prosperous and wonderful country we all want to live in. Today, we have a paper written by our colleague Terence Corrigan here, who is going to talk about exactly how South Africa can get on the path towards getting investment. Before we start, I just want to say thank you very much to the Atlas Network for assisting us with these papers, with sponsoring them. So anyone, I think, who has followed the fortunes of the South African economy over the last couple of decades knows that one of our big problems has been getting investment into South Africa. Investment is a key driver of all sorts of things: economic growth, job creation, that sort of stuff. And ensuring that we have foreign investment flowing into the country, and also that local businesses are investing themselves, is vital to improving the lives, not just of the middle class, not just of business people, but of the poorest of the poor, who depend on the economic opportunities that investment creates. So Terence, we're going to hear from you now, and then after you've been through your presentation, we shall have a little bit of a Q&A session. So please do put your questions in the chat on that one. Thank you very much. And Terence, the floor is yours. Please take it away.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. I've been working on this for a couple of months, and I've entitled it Opening for Business, South Africa's Investment Malaise and How to Escape It. Just let me dwell on that title for a second. South Africa is open for business, something that's been said repeatedly over the years in State of the Nation addresses, at investment conferences, when trade delegations go abroad. And I think the fact that something is said repeatedly indicates that it is not really so, that there is something that is, shall we say, lacking. And that's why I've titled this Opening for Business. Rather than assuming that the country is open for business, which I think is incorrect, I want to look at how we can open the country in that respect. Now, what I'm going to do is I've got a sort of six-part discussion. The first is discussing the South African investment malaise, and I like the word malaise. It suggests a problem, but something that is ongoing and that bogs down movement. Then I'm going to look at South Africa's investment profile. And then I'll be talking about the way that this is correlated with governance, a brief discussion of what we at the IRR term South Africa's three ages. Then to discuss the discrete and the specific investment challenges, I'm going to turn to what is called the XA policy pyramid, which is done by which I borrowed with full attribution, must be said, from very excellent work done by XA Global Trade Advisors, a South African firm, which I think really encapsulates what a country needs for economic success and where those blockages can be. This I will be discussing in a 3-part schematic: foundations, value adders, and drivers, and we'll get into those. And then 5 paths to rehabilitating South Africa's investment environment. And I use that term advisedly. South Africa's investment environment is a broken one. It's not just about improving it or enhancing it. It is about fundamentally rehabilitating it. So, what does it mean to invest? I think this is also something that it's a phrase often used but often imperfectly understood. To invest means to put money into to put capital being resources that generate a return into an environment in the expectation that they will grow. The idea that you will take out more than you put in, which is often used as a sort of a statement of accusation, is actually a truism. It's the foundation of any economy. By putting one's resources in for a period of time, you hope that they will grow and that you will get more out of them. Now, inadequate investment basically is the starting point. If you do not have enough people or enough resources being put into an economy, you will get stunted economic growth. Now, South Africa's economic growth rates have been sitting in sort of single digits, and quite often below single digits for years and years. The National Development Plan spoke about 5.4%. We at the Institute have said that we need to aim for something more ambitious of between 6 and 8%. But if one goes back to 1994, there are only 2 years in which South Africa has come close to the NDP goal. For the most part, it's been under 5%, and over the past decade or so, it's generally fallen under 2%. Where you have a little economic growth, where we have stunted economic growth, you're going to have anemic job creation. Jobs are not something that happen independently of other economic activity. The point about a productive job is that you are trying to make some money. You're going to hire somebody else to help you do it. That is that is job. I understand in the 19th century in France, there was a time when jobs were guaranteed, and the idea was you could go and dig a ditch and then fill it up again. That may be an expenditure of effort, but it is not employment. Where you have investment, you have a growing economy, you have a demand for people to help. And where these things are lacking, you have depressed social well-being. Now, if you think about it, South Africa's official unemployment rate is, sits somewhere north of 30%. There are estimates, which I do discuss in the paper, that suggest this may be too high, since it's underestimating a lot of informal economic activity. I think it's a very important point, and we can get into that. But the point is that even if one accepts an employment rate of 15%, if we accept that there are a large community of discouraged work seekers, people who are simply not trying anymore, and people trapped in poverty, including, I think it's about 1 in every 5 South Africans, struggles with really the basics of life, cost of food and everything. You have a combustible situation. Put all these things together, and what you have is an existential threat to South Africa's future. Now, for those wanting some illustration of this, you can look at Afrobarometer's polling going back to the 1990s. Question was asked, is the country heading in the right direction or not? And you see over time that graph, the proportion of people saying that it is going in the wrong direction has increased, and the proportion saying it's going in the right direction has decreased. And there are a lot of things going on there, but one of the big things is simply that the material conditions, people's prospects for work, for socioeconomic mobility, for a middle-class lifestyle, are not presenting themselves in the to the degree that would be that people hope, and that was certainly hoped at the outset of the democratic transition. What that means is that South Africa as a constitutional democracy has increasingly been tarnished with the idea of failure. And what we saw in the last election was, for the first time, a party that was unambiguously and publicly committed to abolishing the constitutional framework got traction. There have been certainly parties that have been willing to play fast and loose with it, parties whose hearts were certainly not in the constitutional settlement, but this is the first time that we actually had a party platform that said we're going to do away with it. And this leads to there are huge risks there for South Africa's prospects of ever getting that economic takeoff, and also for what it means to be a democracy and a free society. Now, investment as a proportion of GDP. This is an absolutely key metric. It tells us what proportion of the total economy is going into producing for another day, as it were, building factories, for building roads, for building power stations. Now, this goes back to the 1960s, and it's a very interesting graph. In the 1960s, it started off fairly depressed, but as the decade went on, you have a lot of exploration, you had infrastructure rollouts, and by the early 1970s, a lot of that had to do with the rollout of power stations. You got up close to 30%. One economist told me that by certain measures, it actually exceeded 30% at times. But these are the sort of World Bank figures, and I use them as a kind of common currency. One can quibble about the details, but the patterns are clear. As we head into the 1980s, we see investment falling off, and by the early 90s, where South Africa was pretty much in a civil war, investment had kind of stalled at around 15-16%. With the transition, there was a small uptick, but there was definitely, by these numbers, something wrong with our foundations. As we go into the early 2000s, things pick up again, and basically what that refers to is the commodities boom, first of all, and secondly, as we hit 2010, 2012. You start to see a lot more of that. You also see a fairly high level, and what that's referring to is predominantly the power builds, Medupi, Kusile, which came with their own set of problems. Subsequently, though, we've fallen, and I think that it's interesting to note that for the last couple of years, our performance matches the worst periods that we had seen in the whole 1960s plus period. You're talking about early 90s levels. So that is simply catastrophic. Now let's put this against peer countries. The line on the bottom, the light blue line, that's South Africa. Okay, so you see South Africa is, by this basket of comparators, not doing very well. Low-income countries is that short line towards the end. The information from the World Bank is a bit spotty, so we don't have a great deal. But the interesting thing is that as a country, is that, well, let me just explain this first. Sorry. That line on the top is middle income countries, and that's where South Africa should be. That's your Vietnams, that's your Indonesias. These are South Africa's emerging market peers, and you know, looking at that, you will see that this group is tracking at around 35% of GDP. That is, they are taking in a lot of money, a lot of resources, which are being put by to increase their productive capacities. Even we even fall behind the high income group, and that's particularly worrying. Now, it's important to do this disaggregation. Small investments in poorer, low income countries generally reflect in higher investment proportions of GDP, simply because the economy isn't that big. A small amount of investment shows up visibly in their data. High-income countries will generally not show that, because there is a great deal of wealth in the economy. So you need proportionately larger investments to push up that level. But South Africa, as a middle-income country, is falling both below the low-income and the high-income countries. In other words, we are being outperformed by countries that, by all metrics, should not be outperforming us. The big winners of the last 3 decades have been that middle income group. These are, as I say, your Vietnams, Indonesias, Chinas. countries that have been able to take in a lot of value-adding work, as production costs in the high-income world became too expensive. They had the basics, they had the foundations, and they were productive places to operate. Not great always, but okay. And I'll get into that in a moment. Now, South Africa is coming in at about half of where our nominal peers are. In fact, less than half over the last couple of years. That is not a position that we should be in, and I think it shows the depth of the country's malaise, and that is why I advisedly choose the term malaise. Now, going back to 1994, sorry, it seems that my my computer threw off the 1994, but that's 1994. It's important to go back and have a look. What happened at that point? Well, the state was effectively bankrupt. It's often not remembered. There was sustained economic and investment decline, as we've seen. There were also extensive socioeconomic demands. A democratizing population now is in a position to demand particular outcomes from its leadership class. And the ANC took over government as the representative of people who expected a rapid improvement in their standards of living. And it's also often forgotten that the ANC's campaign slogan, or one of its more common ones, was "Vote ANC, jobs, jobs, jobs." That was not land, not South Africa's place on the global stage. That was what concerned South Africa's people. At the same time, the economy opened to the world, and all of a sudden, there were competitive pressures that hadn't been so visible before. And there was also a political acceptance of a market economy, but with the proviso that there would be extensive state intervention, largely, at least in theory, to drive the socio-economic development. Okay, so that was the situation that prevailed at the time of the transition. Now, I mentioned South Africa's three ages. We talk about this at the IRR as a useful way of conceptualizing the way South Africa's governance and its economic fortunes have overlapped. We go back to 1994 to about 2008. That's what we call the first stage. That was essentially the Mandela and the Mbeki presidency. What you see, what a perceptive reader will see there is economic growth rates and investment as a proportion of GDP. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that economic growth, although depressed, generally did start to accelerate, and that came very, very squarely on the back of investment, and that is a very strong correlation that you can see throughout that. What happened in 2008? Well, that was the global financial crisis. I remember there was a little personal anecdote. Standing in my garden when the news of all this started to hit, and a neighbor came by holding a beer and pushing his infant child in a pram, and he just remarked, "Oh, he's just been laid off," and that became the fate for a lot of the country, not least South Africa's middle class. What you see then is a fall both in growth and in investment. Then things started to pick up again. What you must bear in mind, though, is that South Africa, relative to its developing market peers, never recovered. Whereas countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, the global financial crisis was a blip that they soon accelerated away from. This didn't happen in South Africa. We remain mired in it, or at least mired in the same pattern. You then had the spending on the power stations, as I say, which came with their own set of awfulness. And then basically the lack of confidence in the economy, disinvestment, the cloying effects of state failure and corruption, and that's kind of where we remain. Now, those of you who live in Johannesburg probably join me in saying that the Johannesburg of today is a very, very different city from the Johannesburg of 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was a city that was visibly getting wealthier. Now it's shock-worn. That big blip at the bottom there is, of course, COVID, and then there was a rebound growth year. But basically, neither growth nor investment have recovered. The second age then was kind of the Zuma era, call it the state capture, and the early part of President Ramaphosa's incumbency. And we put the third age now as being one in which essentially all bets are off. We do know a lot about the incapacities of the state and about the implausibility of some of what it has tried. But this could be a moment of a turnaround, or it could be a moment of continued decline. So, what has gone wrong? Now, this is why I like the XA policy pyramid. And once again, shout out to XA Global Trade Advisors. Essentially, what they say is that that economic prospects are structured like a pyramid. The more the foundational, the more important things are at the bottom. You need to get those right. When you get those right, the simpler economic activities are made possible. As you go higher up, you need more inputs, you need more complexity, and then as you get to the top, you get what almost becomes a discretionary thing. This is where a highly skilled state can intervene. They call it Heartbreak Hotel in the sense that things like sector prioritization, identifying winners, is inherently difficult for a government to do, and it takes a particularly well networked and capacitated state in order to do this. This is the developmental state terrain, and please keep that idea in mind because it becomes important. Now, I split these into three groups. The first one, infrastructure and security, I call foundations. And this is also what I call good enough governance, or it's a phrase that some economists use. It says that things may not be great. There may well be plenty of corruption. The state doesn't work efficiently, but it can guarantee the basics. In other words, your roads will function, your ports will be able to move goods in and out, and for the most part, you can keep crime at a sort of acceptable level. That is not debilitating. Yes, you have to pay a bribe from time to time, but it's an okay place. This was essentially what a country like Vietnam or China could offer. The next, you get your value adders, or what is called, or what I term good governance. This is human capital, a good regulatory environment, a state that understands how these things fit together. This is basically where you have a professional state. This is one where the state is not generally taking bribes anymore, where career civil servants understand what their job is and are able to perform it, maybe not always with a smile, but satisfactory. And then there's what I call the drivers: developmental governance, sector prioritization, and the identifying winners. This is where you have the striped pants cookie pushers in elevated offices who sit with 3 or 4 PhDs and know all the CEOs by name and are able to argue with them at their own game and decide what is best for the country. The developmental state, in other words. Okay, but in South Africa, we have a bit of a problem. First of all, our foundations. Our foundations are, shall we say, shaky. Crime costs an estimated 9.6% of GDP in both direct and opportunity costs. That's like almost 1 in every 10 rand made in a year is in some ways linked or lost to crime. There's issues with property, physical security. Now, one of the speakers or people I interacted with for this project, businessman, said that his firm had a potential deal with an American company, but their due diligence required them to travel to visit the foreign correspondent firm to do their due diligence. And after Googling the name of the town in which it was located, they said they're not prepared to risk it. I think a lot of that is happening. And then there's organized crime, extortion. If you think about the construction mafias, you think about the taxi mafias, you think about the ability simply to conduct business, being subject to having to pay a bribe, and if you refuse to do it, your very life can be placed at risk. Then there's logistics, infrastructure. Now, this is failing logistics and energy systems, although there has been a little improvement through private sector interventions, we can talk about in a while. But effectively, what you're seeing is a demodernization of the economy. Now, this is important. When your foundations are not in place, even some of the more the simpler and less complex, less sophisticated facets of an economy. I'm thinking of sectors like agriculture. I'm thinking of things like basic trade become a problem. This is an issue throughout the African continent, that the phenomenon of so-called market women. These are ladies who run the sort of semi-traditional markets and are often shaken down by corrupt police officers. They're not making a huge amount of money, but they've got to factor in this big, effectively an extra tax because they're vulnerable. I was also told by an expert in the agricultural sphere that to get maize to Cape Town, it's simpler and cheaper to import from Argentina than it is to truck it in from the Free State. That's simply because of the failure of the road and rail network. Secondly, let's get to the value adders. Now, this is when you sorry. Let me start that again. This is the facet of governance that says, well, you need a state that is able to do things efficiently. It can provide more than just the basics. This is where you start, as I say, where you start seeing that the civil servants are doing things because it's their professional responsibility, not because they need to be bribed for it. Now, in South Africa, this is important. There's been a lot of aversion to low-wage employment, but this comes along with a severe shortage of skills needed for a high-end and high productivity and high-wage economy. And this is why human capital is important here. And we have utterly dismal educational outputs. In other words, a very small portion of the population, which is also typically a far more internationally mobile part of the population, is suitable to do the jobs that the government wants the economy to focus on. This means that you have huge wage distortions. It becomes very expensive to find your skilled people, and you also have an immigration regime that is very hostile to actually bring to allowing those skills in. South Africa has been termed a society that is both over-regulated and under-governed. On the one hand, nothing that the legislature and our ministers like more than throwing out new regulations, often with a very, very tangential connection to reality or economic efficiency or the actual running of a business. But they are often very poorly enforced, and things that need to be enforced, like security, are not. There was a study, and this is from 20 years ago, and I'm not aware of anything more recent. But regulation was found to cost about 6.5% of GDP. That's astronomical. In other words, like 1 rand in every 20 is going towards fulfilling some sort of government demand, some sort of tick box exercise. And in some sectors, there's enormous frustration with the changeability of these things. And then, of course, there's the BE conundrum, which brings a lot of these things together. Demanding that firms cede ownership to empowerment partners. This is all of these effectively impose massive costs. And then the question of knowledge. What I think we see in South Africa, and this is a very political question, is that there is a very ideological view of the world on the part of the government, and also on the part of a number of interest groups. And there's also a lot of vulnerability to interest group pressures. So there is then also a great deal of reluctance to act on experience. So you have implausible policy and governance positioning. If I could give a few examples, one would be the recent regulations around employment equity, that fines are to be instituted that could effectively bankrupt offending firms. But this is often, a very difficult thing to find the right person in a skilled scarce environment, and particularly the right person of the right background in a particular area of the country. All of this is just is setting up a monstrous set of problems. NHI, something that has great implications for the economy across the board, and for whether many of those skilled people will be willing to risk their futures in South Africa. And when I hear the Minister of Health saying that people mustn't be obsessed about the cost of NHI, it just seems that seems to me to be an absolute the kernel of the problem. NHI is about the costs. It is about paying for healthcare costs, and if you can't put a number on it, you haven't even started the debate. But the idea seems to be, create the systems, and we'll figure out, how to make it work later. This is just deeply, deeply flawed, and I would say foolish policymaking. And then there are the drivers. Now, we would all have heard the mantra about a capable state, or about a developmental state, industrial policy, localization. The point is that the idea of a capable state is one that employs meritocratically. Now, the National Planning Commission has said bluntly, South Africa has rejected meritocracy, and this cuts across all sorts of indices. But the state of a municipality like Lekwe in Mpumalanga, which happened to drive through a little while ago, where Astral Foods literally had to get its own water license to draw water from the river to process itself. That just illustrates the continuum. The foundations don't function. There is no governance capacity, so there's no good enough governance. There's no good governance. The idea that a state structured like this is going to be able to exercise some sort of developmental role is wishful thinking. To this, let's add that we have very deficient business-state relations. I think one of our political problems is that we have a political class that, for the most part, is a professional political class. These are often people who have no experience of a life outside of politics, and therefore no appreciation that that business or the profession see things very differently. And as the aphorism goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. Where this has kind of come to a head is in a case like steel, where you have enormous subsidies being put into the so-called mini mills, but also tariffs to protect ArcelorMittal. You have a decline in the local in the quality of local steel. You then have people, you have local manufacturers who actually do add value, who simply cannot get the steel they need and the quantities they need and at the quality they need. And we end up in a point where this has been termed a subsidy economy, where you literally cannot tell what the actual market price of a commodity should be, because there are so many interests that are demanding their slice of the pie, their piece of protection or support. Weak state capacity, ideological predispositions, and policy capture. Now, very important, if one looks at the experience of the so-called developmental states in places like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, the key to a developmental state is a highly, highly skilled and almost non-ideological, although one could argue that point, civil service that employs its best and its brightest purely on merit. People who are networked sufficiently within within society that they can draw on these networks, but who are not captured by any particular interest group. In other words, they do have the knowledge base, and they have the authority to say no, even to very powerful interests, and also to cut deals where it is in the national interest. If this does not sound like South Africa, it's because this isn't South Africa. In South Africa, you do not have the skills, you do not have the state capacity. You have an ideological predisposition that is often hostile to business, which is not the case in most of these or any of these developmental states. And you have policy capture, in terms of think about labor market policy with the influence of the unions. Certain things just are gridlocked. Now, one of my interviewees said this to me: you can do something about individual problems. security, infrastructure, all of that. You just can't do much when policy is deliberately arranged to act as a truncheon against you. This is the way a lot of South African businesses feel, that they could make a plan for the electricity shortages. They can bring in extra private security, but where there is no understanding or a deliberate refusal to acknowledge that there are severe policy constraints, that some things are just not doable, and if they are implemented, they are an existential threat. Like the ceding of equity for empowerment, South Africa simply becomes a non-starter. So, what can we do? Now, the good news is that South Africa still does have advantages. If one speaks, for instance, to foreign business people, and I've spoken to a number of them, foreign investors, would you rather be able to do business in South Africa or Vietnam? Well, the answer is quite simple: South Africa. South Africa has nice weather. It's a society that is far more familiar to them in terms of what they're generally used to, especially certainly if they're from Western countries. It speaks English. Don't underestimate how important that can be, and it has a reasonably strong and predictable legal system. All of these are wonderful recommendations. Plus, South Africa can give you a great lifestyle. So there is nothing inherent, let's say, in Vietnam or in Indonesia that is superior to South Africa. What they have done, though, is they have managed to get the economic pyramid right. So what we need to start with is a recognition question. Investment is necessary. It's necessary from the public sector, from the private sector, and in small amounts and in large amounts. Don't underestimate the effect of, let's say, a small bakery in a township or an informal settlement. These are not. I pull my hair out sometimes when I listen to policymakers talking about we need to encourage entrepreneurship in the townships. There's plenty of entrepreneurship in the townships. Some of it is even scalable. The question is, why is it not growing, or why is it not growing to its potential? And many of those, and the basic reasons have been covered. Second point to realize: investment will be attracted to an environment in which there are reasonable prospects for returns. For reasons that I struggle to understand, the idea that an investor gets more in than he or she gets more out than he or she puts in seems to be taken as a moral condemnation. This is the nature of investment. If there is an opportunity to make money, people will go there. The fact that investment hasn't come in South Africa is not because of an investment strike. In fact, if you look at the breakdown of public to private sector investment, the private sector has always been the majority in South Africa. The problem is, though, South Africa is not a particularly attractive option for investors. The other thing is that not everything can be achieved at once. So you need to prioritize what is most important, what is less important. And there is no substitute for evidence in policy making. And this implies without qualification to attracting investment. There is no such thing as, there is no justification in basing your policy on something like I refuse to believe X, Y, Z. We must accept what the evidence says and follow accordingly. So there are 5 paths to rehabilitate South Africa's investment environment. Get governance in order. It doesn't have to be great, but it needs to be competent. The fact that we have a municipality, as I said, like Lekwe, that could not process raw water, says to me that there is a systems failure that needs to be cleaned out, and maybe you have to start from scratch. But the idea that you can keep that you can deal with this by throwing training at it or by bailouts, no. We've had 30 years to learn. And we need to start taking some of those messages on board. Above all, we need a proper civil service. And those of you who have attended our previous briefings will be aware of a paper that Corrigan and I wrote about the public service. It is too politicized, it is unskilled, and that frankly has been by design. Secondly, rebuild and fortify South Africa's economic foundations: road, rail, ports, electricity. There's been a great deal of resistance over the years to bringing private sector expertise in this, because this was supposed to be something done by the illusory developmental state. The developmental state does not exist. Let's get support from wherever we can. Now, there have been some very, very positive moves of late, but it says something that it took almost 15 years of a power crisis before the government would allow private electricity generation. Ricardo Hausman of the Harvard Growth Lab said that there is no country in the world that has had South Africa's type of power crisis and was so ineffective at dealing with it, simply because the politics around it was all wrong. Third, and here we start to get into the more complex things, and these are longer term. Enhance the stock and pipeline of human capital. Those of you who own businesses will know about your CETA levies. Now, this was in the 1990s. This was meant to fuel a skills revolution. This hasn't worked. We need to rehabilitate our education system. And one thing there, I think, is that the government has to take on the hold of the unions. I'm not saying that unions are the whole problem, or that all educational unions are equally at fault here. But it's often forgotten that there was a state capture report that predated the Big Zondo Commission, which talked about how SADTU had effectively commandeered a number of education departments. Schools function with good management, and this has to be meritocratic management. We have to employ and remunerate good teachers well, and we have to get rid of the deadwood. And that would be a hell of a political fight. But until we do this, we are never going to move into capturing those high wage, high productivity sectors. In fact, South Africa's economy has been decreasing in its complexity. In other words, we are making fewer things. We are involved in fewer sectors now than we were in the past. We are demodernizing. Reform the policy and the regulatory environment. You cannot dangle something like expropriation without compensation over the heads of the country and not expect this to have an impact. And no, explaining it is not a problem. Is not a solution. Beware. If you're explaining, you're losing. Everyone knows that, whether it's on a playground or in a boardroom. I think it is past time that we actually start looking at the evidence. There is a fair amount of evidence that South Africa's empowerment regime, for instance, is very off-putting to particularly to foreign investors, but also to local investors. And then reset the business-government relationship. Very important. A proper relationship between business and government can be a great developmental asset. I'm not talking now. Understand, we're talking cooperation, not collusion. We don't want the CEO of XYZ to walk into the minister's office and come out with protectionist tariffs. But we do want a situation where we can understand one another, and where we can have a proper, robust conversation and seriously take it on board. This, I think, is something that could, in principle, be done tomorrow. But I think I fear that because of the ideological predispositions prevailing in the South African state, it's probably the hardest one to get right. And with that, I would like to thank you for your kind attention. I think we can open the floor now for some questions. I see that there already are a couple in the chat, and if you would like to press me further, please feel free.
Thank you very much, Terence. An excellent overview of exactly the problem, and of course, the consequences of our poor investment environment are felt every day when you see a long line of people standing for grants at a SASSA office, or children begging on the street. All of that has ultimately its roots in the failure of the state to attract investment. Before I get to the ones in the chat, Terence, I just wanted to ask a question about you mentioned the 3 ages that we talk about here at the IRR.
Yes.
The second age, or the age with Mbeki and the first age, the age with Mbeki and Mandela. We saw some of, as you said, some of the closest and best episodes of growth in the country's history. We didn't quite reach the benchmarks that we needed to hit, but we were, there were 3 years where we got kind of close. Was that because, excuse me, was that because of good policy? Was that because of the commodities boom? Why did we get so close in those years?
Combination of things. First of all, there were parts of the state that actually functioned quite robustly. The penetration by things like organized crime was a phenomenon that came later. So, even though governance may not have been great, it was in many respects good enough. There was a cohort of engineering skills, let's say the hard sinews, that was still involved. Many of these people have now immigrated. They've now retired. They've now died. Some of them, and frankly, we have not had the pipeline to push those through again. Anthony Turton wrote an excellent article which got him fired from the CSIR about the state of water engineering, and that was very, very emblematic of the whole situation. Okay, so there was that. There's a certain historical strength that could be coasted on. There was, to some extent, also a bit of a post-liberation honeymoon. South Africa was welcome in every forum, but the big thing from the government side is that they actually took the crisis in public finance seriously. Now, as I said, remember, South Africa was bankrupt. The ANC had come back from exile expecting that it was going to be able to open up a vault that looked like Scrooge McDuck's repository, and everyone would be able to take off their clothes and go swimming in these Krugerrands. In point of fact, there were dirty pictures. There was a slideshow that Derek Keys, I think, showed to Trevor Manuel and said, "This is the reality. There's no money." And this was then shown to various movers and shakers in the ANC, and they said, "Wow." So they actually took that very seriously, and so after some initial stuttering, South Africa's macroeconomic picture was looking very good. In fact, I think you could make an argument that for that sort of 15-year period, the direction of play had never been better, not since 1910. So there you go. As far as but I think it's also important to bear this in mind that investment, particularly when is largely a private sector affair. And what you had there was the commodities boom. You had, interestingly, it wasn't so much putting money into commodities. Our receipts increased, but not so much our output. This is also regulatory. The mining charter put a big kibosh on that, but you could get more money for what you were exporting. I remember Australia, I think, upped its coal output by something like 60%, South Africa by about 3% over that period. So numbers like that, don't quote me on it. But there was a lot more money going around in the country, so you could put up shopping malls, and a lot of it kind of Peter Bruce has said we had our boom by shopping. And I think that's quite accurate. Also, the expansion of things like private education, private hospital care. There was a lot of money in South Africa, and a lot of it was being spent in the anticipation that things were going to improve. Now, we got whammied by the global financial crisis, which there's one thing we couldn't, is a black swan event. But the point is that what followed that, there were, I think, so many hazards on the horizon that kind of crept in along with that crisis that we just never recovered. Also, the governance failures, if I put my finger on it, happened in 1997 with the ANC's decision deliberately to politicize the state. Now, that took a long time to filter through, and there was a better quality of person who was available at that time to fill some of these. But as it simply became a spoil system, and as the state was torn apart by conflict between Zuma and Mbeki, by the time the Zuma era state capture came in, he was really just cresting a wave that had been building for over that period. So mixed bag. But that fundamentally explains it.
Interesting. Just a reminder that if you want to read any of our reports in the Blueprint for Growth paper series, you can go to irr.org.za/reports, where you will be able to find all of them, including this one that we're discussing today. Okay, one of the comments that we've seen in the chat here is, from my professional experience, the part of reform the policy and regulatory environment is critical to start from. The way it is, even if the intention behind regulation was making sense, the interpretation and implementation is so often nonsensical. It affects all spheres of everyday life, work, security, stability. For me, personally, the double PRA real estate scenario is one of the latest examples of ideologically interpreted rules are creating unintended consequences. I think I see this repeated all the time in. I know I hear stories often from the mining industry so you sort of see a similar thing. Is sometimes even the policy will change, or the minister will say we must have X, and officials on the ground will just refuse sort of to implement as has been directed. Your thoughts?
Right. Okay. I think there's a few things. Nazmira Mullah, the financial whiz and oftentimes commentator, wrote probably about 2008. She often hears South Africa has good policy with bad implementation, and she questions that if you can't implement the policy, it's bad policy. You've got to make sure those two things line up. Now, if Ms. Mullah ever gets this message, please tell her I think that she, said something that changed my life. That's just a reality. We do not have a state that is capable of implementing this sort of thing. So you have this sort of, you have enormously complex regulation, but no capacity to put it through. You then often will end up defaulting to what can fit on the spreadsheet of an official who's probably not very informed. This is why things like why something like the Employment Equity Commission is able to produce its reports on time. That with charts, graphs, and headings about that there's fewer of the Indian female group in this occupational category than of the colored female group, and etc. etc. That's and people can get very upset about that, and it shows just. But interesting, none of those reports, and I've read them pretty much all, indicate actually try to explain why this is the case. It's just, well, we assume that this must be the situation. Now, in a developmental state, you will actually have officials who will have some idea of why this is the case and maybe some sympathy with it. But yeah, and sometimes I think that there is an intention that behind policy drives that is, shall I say, incomprehensible to the rational person. That perhaps it is for a deeply committed ideologue more important that an errant firm is closed down for not having a correct racial mix than actually having that firm existing, or that a 35% or 40% unemployment is an appropriate or is an acceptable price to pay for signaling about the importance of the labor movement and workers' rights. I'd taking out the idea that these consequences may not be entirely unintended. I think that we get back to a situation that we have an officialdom that is just largely not able to understand these things. And this is not necessarily even it's not a moral criticism. I remember asking a gentleman some years ago who was a representative for the Democratic Alliance, but had been a financial journalist and had been involved in business development, about the Department of Trade and Industry as it was at the time. And I said, do they care? And he said, look, you must understand that they're officials. They have a particular prescription. that's what they're going to follow. They can't quite make the mental leap into understanding that these people actually have to run businesses. It's a different set of incentives. So yeah, and I think until my suggestion then is to say I would rather see less intervention, not necessarily as a normative goal, purely as a pragmatic one, because more intervention cannot be dealt with or cannot be handled. I know that someone's going to call me a neoliberal son of a watch it or whatever. By all means, if that makes you happy, by all means, call me what you want. I'm good. But the problem, the thing is that it's this, as I say, we're not even in ideological territory anymore. It's just, this doesn't work. We need to do something else.
Right. I think that's one of the keys here, is that there's been so much clinging on to ideology from the government side, and I think within the ANC that there's just been a lack of pragmatism, and kind of every answer you've given reflects that over and over again, about the sort of unwillingness to change or to grapple with the circumstances we sit with. Okay. Just a reminder to everyone, please do go to irr.org.za/reports and check out the Blueprint for Growth series. Of course, this paper is there, Blueprint for Growth 7. We at the IRR believe that it's a really important series that is key to be taken on board by the public and by policymakers if we want to actually see the South Africa that we all dream that we could see, one that is prosperous, where poverty is decreasing, and where people can live out their life goals, aspirations, in peace and harmony. Thank you very much, Terence, for your presentation today. It was some excellent stuff, and I hope that everyone has a wonderful day going forward. Cheers.
Bye-bye.